So Kenya is facing very acute imperialism crisis. The only way that the Kenyan people can liberate themselves is by undertaking their own revolution. It is difficult to defeat imperialism or negotiate with imperialism through diplomacy. So we find ourselves very relatable to the struggles of the Palestinian people. But even for us who understand also the pain of indirect colonial rule and imperialism, we see Palestine as a theater where imperialism want to try their weapons. Zionism in Israel is a settler colony that can only be defeated through resistance.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Floodgate Podcast, a vital space brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. Here, we delve into today's critical issues, cutting through the noise of mainstream narratives to bring you a deeper understanding of what is taking place in Gaza and the rest of Palestine. I am Buna Mbai. I'm a member of the Pan African League Umoja and the Pan African Brigade for Palestine. I'll be the host for today for this interview, for which I'm honored, pleased, and we have the privilege to have a very, very special guest, Booker Omole. So, Booker Omole is a Kenyan political activist. He's the General Secretary of the Communist Party Marxist Kenya. Prior to that, Booker served as the National Vice President of the Communist Party of Kenya. For several years, Booker has been involved in the fight against neo-colonialism, foreign debt, police brutality, extractivism, and militarization. Early this year, Booker has survived an assassination attempt, and he's also been the target of the neo-colonial state of Kenya. So, Comrade Booker, welcome to the Floodgate Podcast, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Comrade Buna. And it's unfortunate I wasn't able to meet you last week because of the events in Kenya, but I'm glad to speak to you today in regard to the Kenyan Revolution and its relationship to the global revolutionary events. So I'm quite happy to be here today.
Thank you. So, like you said, the interview was, we had planned for the interview 2 weeks ago, but unfortunately, there was a police raid in your offices. Several of your comrades have been arrested. But this is just a continuation of the repressive measures that have been implemented by the neo-colonial Kenyan state, neo-colonial Kenyan government. So I was wondering if you could talk about the recent developments in Kenya, the turmoil that has been happening even as we speak, because recently, and this is for some of our uh, in the audience, some in the audience who might not be familiar with the political situation right now in Kenya. So could you tell us more about the recent demonstrations that were repressed by the government? I think there was over 16 people who were killed in the last few days. So yeah, please give us some, if you could give us some updates on the current situation in Kenya and how your party has been involved in those anti-neo-colonial and anti-repressive movements.
It's important to acknowledge that what is happening in Kenya is not different from what is happening from the majority of the globe, particularly during the imperialism crisis. So Kenya is facing very acute imperialism crisis. It's important to look at it into that context because the Kenyan government is struggling a lot in regard to meeting its debt obligation, particularly to IMF and World Bank, the Paris Club. So there is also the Kenyan government cannot act on its own at the moment because the IMF and World Bank and the Paris Club has actually imposed certain conditionalities on their debt. And it therefore means that Kenya is under an indirect imperial rule. So even though we are dealing with a neo-colonial state, we are dealing with a government of the day, but this is just another puppet of the United States imperialism. And it's important to acknowledge that even though we appeal as much as possible to the Kenyan government to give dignity to the majority of the people. But the truth is, the only way that the Kenyan people can liberate themselves is by undertaking their own revolution. It is difficult to defeat imperialism or negotiate with imperialism through diplomacy. So at the moment, we have a crisis in our country, and that crisis is that the Nairobi stands at the epicenter of finance capital, but Nairobi still represents the backwardness of a neo-colonial economy. In fact, Nairobi is not fully a capitalist developed, or Kenya is not a fully capitalist state. Kenya, the 70% of the Kenyan population still live in the backwardness of rural areas. And the feudal relation still dominates in the 70% of the population. The imperialist hegemony that has imposed upon the Kenyan people have not even favored the development of capitalism in Kenya. So indeed, Kenya is not even developing as a capitalist state. Kenya is just being retained as a backward, semi-feudal society with the dominance of imperial rule and with its particularity of some capitalist relations. So even though everybody goes to the street to demand that this government could provide life with dignity, that could provide them with jobs, but essentially the government of the day is incapable in its systemic foundation to offer any meaningful services to the Kenyan people. So how does the government react to it? Because now the government cannot continue lying to the people. They have lost total public opinion. They have lost the propaganda war. So it basically means that the only reason why the Kenyan government is standing now is because that it has monopoly of violence. So the government is reacting, its reactionary base, mainly through ethnic chauvinism and highlighting a lot of divisive politics, even if it's not tribal, religion hatred, to make sure that the majority of the Kenyan people remain as divided as possible, so that the strategic and inevitable fall of this government is delayed. So this is why people are going to the street, because people are going to the street just asking for certain simple things. People want jobs every day, but how can a government provide jobs if there's no industrialization, if we do not have mechanization of agriculture? The entire Kenyan economy is only breathing because of the loot that the Kenyan government is able to take from the neighboring countries. But indeed, the majority of the Kenyan people cannot live a life with dignity, especially under the dominance of imperialism that continues to make sure that the Kenyan development remains totally undeveloped. Even whatever kind of development, the productive forces are nowhere else to be seen here in Nairobi. Nairobi is a city, but it's only a city for services and finance. There's no industry taking place. In fact, sometimes we call it a big warehouse, a big imperialist warehouse in Nairobi that cannot actually sustain its population. So the economy of Kenya, as we have it today, is under the hands of imperialism, and there is a social explosion in the street. The Communist Party, Marxist, is taking a greater part to make sure to consolidate that struggle and to direct the masses to their real enemies, and probably to also give a clear analysis on what is it that is happening on the street.
Thank you, Comrade Buka. You mentioned previously, and I'm just going to paraphrase what you said. You say that imperialism cannot be defeated through diplomacy. And I think that we had recently an event that showcased what you just mentioned, which is the fact that Israel and the United States decided to launch an illegal um, assault, aggression against Iran, while Iran and the United States were in the process of negotiation uh, regarding the Iranian nuclear program, right? So this was a surprise. There was a surprise attack that was launched by Israel on June 12th, if I'm not mistaken. But there was a response from Iran that uh, neither Israel nor the United States were expecting. And I think that despite the fact that Netanyahu is boasting right now about a victory, I think it's clear to most observers and even to non-specialists that Israel has basically been defeated. So I wanted to ask you, what is your analysis of the Israeli-American aggression uh, against Iran, and what are the implications of the defeat of Israel and the United States against in their campaign against Iran? What are the implications for the forces in the global South that are fighting imperialism, neocolonialism?
The majority of the people in the global South, particularly in the African continent, and even more narrowly within the Kenyan society, stands in complete solidarity with the Iranian people. It's important to note that because why do they stand in solidarity with the Iranian people? Just for the only reason that Iran is standing against the arrogance of the United States imperialism and its junior Western partners. This is important. And the United States imperialism has continued to devastate the African continent. In fact, when Iran stood up against the United States imperialism, there was a celebration in the African continent, particularly after the United States sitting president, Barack Obama, bombed Libya and killed its sitting president. And every time the African people continue to see the devastating effects of the United States imperialism, even the so-called African is not really an African anymore. It is actually a military command in the hands of imperialism that continues to cause havoc in the African continent. So we see the Iranian people, the heroic people of Iran, as the glorious people that were at this time. The United States is one country that likes to walk into any nation and bomb them back into decades of centuries without paying the consequences. But at the moment, it is only Iran that the United States have attacked in his last, since they launched the fallacy of the war on terror, that has retaliated, that has confronted the hegemonic tendency of the United States imperialism. This is a bold step. And to say that the Iranian people cannot, relent on their sovereignty, on their right, to defend the sovereignty of their state and their people. It's important for us to acknowledge that. And the second part of it is that the African countries also have one clear lesson from Iran, that we do not have the United States puppets running the Iranian government. And for us from the Communist Party Marxists, that we have come up with a clear analysis on how to carry out the Kenyan revolution on the two-stage theory, where we have to first return the sovereignty of the Kenyan people, weaken and defeat imperialism here in our national borders before we can start the urgent task of socialist construction. We can say completely that Iran was able to weaken the United States imperialism forces within the Iranian borders, and they have actually channeled a future for the Iranian people. It may not be perfect, that future, but we know for sure that the Iranian people are in charge of that future without external interference. Mm-hmm. So in that case, we can say that Iran is a sovereign republic. While we could say nothing to that extent in referring to Kenya, where I come from, where it is a neocolonial, neocolonial semi-feudal society that is being actually run by a puppet of the United States. In fact, the opposition leaders and the Kenyan politicians are competing every day how much they can sell themselves and prostitute themselves to the Western powers. This is not what we are seeing in Iran. So the majority of the Kenyan population and the African people see a lot of hope in regards to Iran contributing to the strategic decline of the United States imperialism. And this is why in our analysis, we also stand in solidarity with Iran even though some people will say that Iran is a theocracy. But even in that theocracy, we see the Iranian religious democracy as a counter rejection to the United States hegemony that insists that only liberalism democracy can be sustained. So in that case, we say that the Kenyan people must also be allowed to say clearly, like the Iranian people say, that never again shall the Kenyan people be humiliated by either imperialism or their agents within their borders, because this is what the Iranian people has achieved. So for us, we see a lot of possibilities. Benjamin Netanyahu can say that the Iranian people have lost, but he knows only to win by killing unarmed babies and building settlements on the babies' graves. Such a person cannot stand, against the mighty army of Iran, because there are consequences. The problem with the dominance class in the United States and their Western allies is because they want to fight a war and they don't want to die in that war, because they want children of the poor working class to continue to sacrifice themselves for them actually to continue to multiply their profits in the military industrial complex. But Iran, and that's why the Communist Party Marxist takes even a very clear stand in regard to DPRK, that indeed the deterrence forces, the nuclear deterrence forces, is what actually United States understands. If any countries declares themselves nuclear capable, then you can be sure that the United States will not bomb them. But as long as that is not the case, then you realize that United States can walk into any countries, bomb their military, impose their will against the collective will of the national people. So we say completely that Iranian people are on the right track. Zionism in Israel is a settler colony that can only be defeated through resistance, because we did not defeat our own colonizers by diplomacy. So we are sure that the Iranian people, the resistant Axis, the Yemen people, the Iraqi, the Hezbollah, the Hamas, are the people on the correct path, even though there are people who think that they can negotiate with Zionism and probably negotiate a two-state solution and coexist peacefully. But that is just, a dream. You cannot negotiate with the people who have actually grabbed land and they're not willing to give back that land. The people have stolen from the majority of the Palestinian people, but they're not willing to compensate them. So in actual sense, what I'm pushing through is that the majority of the Kenyan people, the majority of the African people stand shoulder to shoulder with our Iranian brothers and sisters. And we know for a fact that Iran will triumph over the evil forces of Zionism and United States imperialism.
Thank you, Comrade Booker. Just for our audience, clarification, you mentioned AFRICOM. I don't know if everybody is familiar with AFRICOM. So for those who don't know, AFRICOM is the U.S. military command in Africa. Has several bases in practically all the majority of the countries in Africa. It's one of the wing of U.S. military imperialism in Africa. Yeah, I had a question that is related to what you've just mentioned regarding the similarities between settler colonialism and how it was defeated in Africa, and um, um, the way it has been implemented, is still being implemented and resisted, as you mentioned, in Palestine. So the occupation of Palestine and the genocidal violence that it entails is a continuation of European settler colonialism that was experienced in various parts of the globe, as you mentioned, including in Kenya, the country where you're sitting now, which was home to one of the most important anti-colonial movements in Africa in the 20th century. So, Buka, could you talk about the significance of the Mau movement and the legacy of one of its leaders, who happened to be one of the mentors, okay, one of the inspirators of the Communist Party Marxist Kenya, Dedan Kimathi. How significant was that movement, the Mau movement, and also the importance of Dedan Kimathi in the fight against European settler colonialism in Africa?
First of all, settler colonialism has had very devastating effects in the African continent. And there is no people that understand the pain of colonialism and the backward imposition of foreign dominance rule to dominate the people, to dispossess the people of their land, and to enslave them on the very land that they once occupied. In 1957, that's when the Mau was at its peak. And it's also important to understand that the Mau was never called the Mau. It was the name that the British actually gave the land and freedom army that was being led by Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. It was meant to be a derogatory name. But since culture is fluid, people adopted the name, cleaned it with the blood of the martyrs, and it actually was the name that now took significance in the Kenyan national liberation struggle for independence. Now, when you have a direct colonial rule, where you have a foreign power that comes to your people to dispossess them of land, it is always easy to consolidate the national question and probably fight the external invaders, especially in that magnitude that it happens in the African continent, where the African people are being colonized by different imperial powers at that time. Now, what brings real significance to us with the Palestinian struggle, and we even echo completely the sentiments of Mandela when he says that the African liberation is actually incomplete when the Palestinian is still being dominated by Zionism. It's very clear similarities. And if you look at, for example, Dedan Kimathi was bad-mouthed by the United States of America and even the British colonialism to be a terrorist, in the sense that anybody who has emerged to represent his people, to mobilize them against the foreign invaders, the foreign land dispossessors, and even the people who have stolen land from the local people, have always been called terrorists, in the essence, to isolate them from the people that they actually really stand for, and to try and bring conflict between the people and their leaders that have actually stood for the benefit of the majority. Because imperialism cannot survive if it does not succeed in dividing the local communities. So remember, other than bringing out the Palestinian question as a fight between religious groups, between Islam and the Christian community, which was quite just a lie, they even tried to bring it out that they tried to justify it with some biblical text, knowing that the African population were highly Christian at that time. So they exploit certain collective misunderstanding of the majority of the people to make sure that they create splits in the people's camp. So if you ask me why we see a lot of solidarity from the African continent with the Palestinian people, is we can see that the entire Gaza Strip, even before the events of last year, was literally an open air prison. This is what the British used to do in Kenya, where peasants were taken off their land, and then the white settlers occupied vast lands, and then they were taken into concentration camps. And then they were expected to offer land, to offer actually labor almost for free. And even the incentive to offer labor to the white settler was not for the Kenyan person or the African native person to sustain their life, but it was to pay certain taxes that was imposed upon them by the colonial regime. So you have been alienated from land, then you have to offer labor to pay land tax, to pay other taxes that the government requires you to do. Then you have to till your land to feed yourself. This is the double exploitation that actually inspired the national resistance for land and freedom that was led by Dedan Kimathi. And we see a lot of similarities how Hamas, confronts the entire, resistant axis, confronts the Zionist entity in the occupied Palestinian territory. And also the concept of the armed struggle through the guerrilla tactic. It's a very common thing for the National Liberation Army, particularly Mau here. So we find ourselves very relatable to the struggles of the Palestinian people. But even for us who understand also the pain of indirect colonial rule and imperialism, we see Palestine as a theater where imperialism want to try their weapons, as a theater to where imperialism want to impose its hegemony and make sure that there is permanent war in the west of Asia. We also see that it is a hotspot for imperialism, particularly the United States. That it's also important that the resistance building in the Palestine also reflects the resistance against imperialism on all the neocolonial projects in the global south. So the legacy of Dedan Kimathi is that you cannot particularly defeat colonialism or settler colonialism by negotiating with the people who have taken land off your back, and then they do not want to give back that land, but they want you people to coexist peacefully as brothers and sisters. That's unacceptable. So the Palestinian people will never accept the land grabbers to live alongside them peacefully, because this is what settler colonialism is. The bloodshed that continues in Gaza can only influence and make more resistance even come out to make sure that the Palestinian people can resist, because the law is wherever there is an oppression, there is also resistance. So we don't see the Zionist dream coming true, because for them, they're living in the old society where, the British migrated to, for example, Australia, and massacred all the native communities, and all the indigenous population were actually killed, and turned that settler colony into what Trump will call the beautiful project. This will never happen with Palestine. Look at the United States of America, which is entirely another settler colony, because the natives were murdered and dragged off their land. And if you look at the stories of Christopher Columbus, it's very disturbing to know that that history of America continues to carry out that legacy to date. So what we would like to bring forth as the Kenyan revolutionaries is that the fight against imperialism that we see its weakest link in Gaza can only grow wider. There is no solutions. Sometimes we wonder when we see peace movements, where particularly in Europe and the United States, saying peace now. But how can that peace happen? They should be recognizing that sometimes war is the highest level of contradiction in the society. Because now, even if we call, for example, when the Iranian retaliatory, legitimate return of fire to the Zionist entity happened, everybody was crying to have peace. But peace mainly means negotiating with Zionism to advance Zionism. But Zionism will not give up by itself. That we have talked about Iran, and now we are willing to give up the land we have been robbing from the Palestinian people for the longest time as possible. So I think verily we can confirm that the Land Resistance Army that was led by Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi correctly stated that the only road to defeating settler colonialism is through political education, political organization, and armed resistance as the main tactic. And I think the Hamas has been able to give more dignity than any other organization in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we remain solidarity with Hamas, the Hamas leaders, the Palestinian people, and we hope that they could be able to understand that the entire peace-loving majority of the residents of the world actually supports their project, and see it as one of the avenues to break the back of the United States, declining empire.
You mentioned what Nelson Mandela said about the importance of the Palestinian struggle for Africans. And before I move to the next question, I would just wanted to quote what Mandela said in 1999 in Shalti, which is a refugee camp in Gaza. So Mandela said, the history of our two peoples, Palestinian and South African, correspond in such painful and poignant ways that I intensely feel myself being at home amongst compatriots. So this is what Mandela said in 1999 in Shalti, which is a besieged refugee camp as we speak. There have been a lot of massacres that have been perpetrated by the Israeli army there. Um, so, in a piece that was published last year, Ugandan scholar and activist Yusuf Serunkuma argued that, and I'm quoting him, Africa is Palestine in slow motion. And talking about the genocide in Gaza, Seruma added, the more I watch the news, the carnage, death, and destruction, the more I worry for the African continent. So, my question is, do you think that there has been somehow in Africa, among activists, not even talking about governments, an underestimation of the implications of the genocide in Gaza on the fate of the continent?
First of all, it's important that the massacre in Palestine has reached a level where the contradictions are heightened and imperialism cannot robe only through propaganda and deception. So then it has to turn out in its most ugliest and inhumane form, which is direct fascism, to try and liquidate any resistance that goes against, the privileged class to retain land as the primary weapon of production, and also to try and limit all the democratic processes and rights that happens among a people. So if we say that, for example, that the people of Palestine is actually African in slow motion, the understanding is that there will be only one option left for imperialism to pillage Africa, which is by the use of raw violence, like what is happening in Palestine today. A genocide that is unfolding in the eyes of the majority of the people that claim to uphold certain values, that claim to uphold certain international obligations, standards, and laws. It is unfolding upon our eyes in all our cameras, in all our TVs. But it's important to say that the United States and its Western allies still continue to insist on the rule of law and the right for the genocidal Zionist entity called Palestine, Zionist entity, sorry, called Israel, to defend itself. This is crazy in the sense that now they are able to loot from the African countries through, establishing their puppet regimes, that they're able to deceive the African people to fight in useless tribal wars while they continue to loot their continents. But what will happen when the African people will learn that it's important to consolidate themselves against their primary and the principal enemy, which is United States imperialism? Then they will have no option but to unleash the violence that we have seen unfolding in our eyes in Gaza. And a good example could be the Libyan project, where Colonel Muammar Gaddafi actually started a policy of protecting the sovereignty of the Libyan people and even advancing its influence around other countries within the African continent to try and challenge the hegemony of the dollar and to try and find, a universal currency that is anchored on the African gold. This challenges the United States dollar dominations. And therefore, if they could not stop Muammar Gaddafi through bribery, corruption, deception, they decided to sponsor a dissident in Libya. And if they could not achieve their objectives through their local puppets, they initiated a bombing campaign that ended up turning Libya into a ghost city and killing their leader. This is what will happen to the African continent if the United States imperialism does succeed in Gaza, because that they will be bold enough, they will know they can get anything they want in the global south. And if the Kenyan people refuse to give them what they want, then the only way will be not to deceive, because the Kenyan people already know their tactics of deceiving. So they will start only dropping bombs and trying to enforce consent, forceful consent, to actually make sure that their will and their robbery and pillage continues in the African continent. If every African person understands this, then it will remind them of the inevitable reality that after the Gaza is disseminated, then the African continent will follow through to be disseminated, exploited, and even plundered directly as it was during the colonial period. So the Kenyan people, the African native people, must respond in solidarity with the Palestinian project to make sure that the United States is defeated in that part of the world. If that so happens, then the Kenyan people and the African people will find a way to actually build their own countries in their own aspirations and in the interest of the majority of the residents of those respective countries.
Thank you, Comrade Booker. So I wanted to talk about the Zionist influence in East Africa. So East Africa has been over the past few, you can say over the past few, at least 2 decades, one of the most strategic entry points of Israel's influence in Africa. So countries like Uganda, um, um, Rwanda, which we don't talk about very often, but Rwanda has very close relationship with Israel, including in terms of uh, so-called security, which is another way of saying supplying weapons, and even Kenya. So those are three countries in East Africa, three East African giants, despite the fact that Rwanda is a small country in territory, that are very close to Israel. So I was wondering if you could talk about the strategic importance of East Africa for Zionist and U.S. Imperialism, and how that influence is manifested.
Uh, Primarily, to start off, Zionism, particularly the state of Israel, has built a lot of image around itself, especially in the African continent. This has since disappeared, but they did quite good for themselves by saying that the Israel army, is invincible and cannot be defeated. So for that reason, they got so many contracts to train our military personnel, and they were paid for it. And they still continue to have certain military contracts with the Kenyan regime, in the essence that if you want your army to be strong, like IDF, then you should be able to accept, Zionists to come and train your army. So they have literally embedded themselves in the armies of the African countries. This, of course, is a threat in regards to the sovereignty of those countries, particularly even in the Kenyan today. So normally the politicians here in Kenya, they try to brag like their bodyguards have been trained in Tel Aviv, and that it's not easier to kill them because the Tel Aviv is known to produce able bodyguards around the world. So they have sold this mirage for a long time and been able to extract surplus from the African countries, particularly the African leaders that believed that the security personnel that are trained in Israel can actually help them survive in power. And in Nairobi, where we have seen a social explosion in the streets, we can also see the link between the how the suppression of the civilian that are literally exercising only their right to peacefully picket in town, how they are being repressed by the Israel trained police officers. And I last time even we made certain samples to pick tear gas canisters in the street, and you could see on them made in Israel. So in essence, for them, they have been able to sell the entire African dictators and neo-colonial puppets a mirage that they can protect them from the people, and they can support them. And sometimes they even put money to make sure that they can influence African elections. It is unfortunate that even today, the African leaders, particularly here, the Kenyan politicians, still go to Israel to pay homage and to ask for arms to make them sustain their political projects when the elections are nearing. So when you talk about influence of Zionism in the African continent, it's not just ideological through psychological warfare and offensive to try and dilute any rigor in terms of the people's thinking, to make sure that the Israel is actually exposed for what it is, which is settler colonialism. But they try to use biblical text mainly to promote their propaganda and set up a fight, an interreligious fight, in the name of fighting the Muslim nation, while failing to tell the majority of the Kenyan people that indeed people are fighting on their right to land and freedom, their civic, their human rights, their survival rights, prison to exist within the land. So successfully, this was done until 2010, but it also crumbled with them. And the whole project that the Israel army is invincible has continues also to crumble, because you can see the David slaying the Iron Dome could not even sustain continuous Iranian missiles. And for the first time in the history of the chaotic Israel administration under Netanyahu, they were sure that they're not going to fight with Iran without having to pay the biggest price for it, because Iran's ballistic missiles could literally penetrate what the American, best military innovation, because and it literally also by extension means that the United States is not safe even where they have placed their military bases in the countries in the west of Asia. And this has also been proved by, again, the Iranian retaliation attacks in the last few days. So it's important to say that the progress that the Israel and the Zionist entity has been able to try and penetrate African continent through deception by imposing their ideologies, spreading their narratives in the African continent, hiring, bloggers, and try to influence African musicians and cultural practices to actually bring out Israel as the most moral entity and the most successful project that has succeeded to turn out a desert and the most powerful country that has been able to wage a war against several countries, and is built out of the total sacrifices of the Israel people, without having to say how much United States dollars that is being funded to Israel to actually kill innocent people. How much military aid does the United States give to their military outpost in the name of the Zionist entity Israel? So this consistent psychological warfare against the African people made Zionism to win briefly in terms of their propaganda war before. Now their propaganda is waning and they cannot be able to sustain it. In fact, nobody believes that the person who has been massacring babies and children can claim to have a right, a right of self-defense. Self-defense against who? While you have started the war itself. It brings out just the most nastiest part of it, that imperialism do not even have a foreign policy, because you cannot invite the Iranian generals to come and negotiate with you. Then you use face recognition to make sure that you map them out and kill them, and then go ahead and ask them to come to the negotiation table. So this is the most hypocritical Trump and the United States ruling class, that it's unacceptable to the planet, that because nobody can trust this regime that actually tricks people into death traps and then want to bring them back to the negotiating table. So for us, we just want to bring clarity to the United States imperialism that the entire Zionism project, as we see it today, and its offensive in the African continent, even in its minutest form. Remember, the racist Zionist government under Netanyahu offered to pay Ugandan governments and Rwandan governments, to deport Black people because they claim that the Black people traumatized the majority of the white Jews community there. This is insane, So we would just want to bring that clarity that the contradictions have since heightened. The Israel regime remains naked. They will never regain that public image that they were able to build out of a lie, and their military capabilities are strategically declining with the strategic decline of the United States. And it's only now just a matter of time. So the United States and their military outpost in the west of Asia by the name Israel can decide, do they want to fall with dignity, or do they want to fall destructively by everyone? Because the only thing why they are not totally bombing Iran or DPRK is because they do not want a war that some of them will die, the rich privileged people. But are they willing to take that risk in the name of United States interest, or what Trump's call American first? It's a total lie to try to convince the majority of the world that your country comes first and you can bomb any countries and dictate even the issues of nuclear proliferation. It's pretense for United States and Israel to claim that a country like Iran cannot have nuclear warheads. What about Israel? Because they do have. Then, if they do have it, why not other countries should have it? And in terms of even signing the non-proliferation treaty, nuclear treaty, not even Israel has signed it. Iran has signed it. So what are you telling us? That you can be, this world is not your backyard where you say what needs to be done, you want to police it. So these are certain contradictions that we can see. But again, there is a lot of hope, the resistance that is going on. There is revolutionary optimism in Nairobi, in Tel Aviv, in Washington. We can see masses are arising to challenge, the United States imperialism. This is important for us to acknowledge.
Yes, thank you, Buka. I know we're running out of time, but I still had one last question. I don't know if people can see very clearly in the background where you're sitting. There's a big photo of Amilcar Cabral, who is one of the greatest Pan-African anti-colonial leaders of the 20th century, the liberator of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde against the Portuguese colonialism. He was also a big supporter of the Palestinian people, the fight of the Palestinian for dignity and self-determination and liberation. And in 1965, just wanted to quote Amilcar Cabral. So at his opening address of the Portuguese anti-colonial movements in the Portuguese colonies, he said, and I'm quoting Cabral: we are with the refugees, the martyrized refugees of Palestine, who have been tricked and driven from their own homeland by the maneuvers of imperialism. We are on the side of the Palestinian refugees, and we support wholeheartedly all that the sons of Palestine are doing to liberate their country, and we fully support the Arab and African countries in general in helping the Palestinian people to recover their dignity, their independence, and their right to live. So I guess I have a twofold question, right? Question in two parts. So first, and this is going to be the last question: what is your assessment of the reaction of the left, the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial left in Africa? It seems that it's regarding the genocide in Gaza. It seems that the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial left in Africa is not as strong as it used to be. And also, how can Pan-Africanism and socialism be revived with Palestine as a major unity point?
Now, the African left, since the end of the Cold War and the World War II, and the following up the disintegration of the USSR, there has been what we call, a strategic pause for the left, because the reactionary forces were way much stronger, in the sense that the United States have been able to even impose its hegemony in quite extreme way against socialist projects. So the left is also not united in questions like Palestine. For example, the backward poisoners, Trotskyites, who have insisted to call Hamas a terrorist organization while claiming to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people, is unbelievable. Even the fact that some leftists still say that Israel has a right to actually defend itself is another unfortunate lie, in the sense that settler colonialism has no right to defend the land that they have taken from the natives that they have dispossessed of land. So this is important, that the left, though some sections of the African left want to say that they're in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. But being in solidarity is not about being sympathetic, is to see Palestinian as a vanguard against imperialism and analyze the war that is taking place in Palestine, in essence, on how to defeat the dominance decaying project, which is imperialism. But you cannot say that, because after all, we do an analysis to advance a clear policy. So in essence, if you're supporting the resistance movement, you must take a stand. You cannot be with the settlers, you cannot be with the land grabbers, and still be with the victims whose their lands have been grabbed. So the consolidation of the African left is a recent phenomenon. Um, uh, in and it has also emerged because of the imperialism crisis in the majority of the African countries, where the majority of the young people are desiring and fighting for life with dignity, because the indirect imperial rule that sustains neocolonies cannot give life to dignity with the majority of these people. So there is an inquisitive mind of the African people. Why is it possible that Africa has so much in terms of resources, but yet so poor? But the Western European American logic want to blame the poverty of the African people on the African themselves, without looking at the exploitative relationship in terms of trade and economy that exists between the African economies and the economies of the metropole. This is insane in essence. So the unity of the left in the Africa, we can say it has been advancing to come up with a clear ideological line, and also on ways to challenge imperialism. Because imperialism cannot only just be challenged by hate. You can hate a bad system, but you must have the right tools to defeat it. So in the sense, you can be angry at imperialism, but if you're not doing exactly the right thing to defeat and weaken imperialism, then you're just a sympathizer. You cannot be called, a fighter, an anti-imperialist fighter. So in essence, also, this can be brought to your second stage of the question, which is Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is quite a confusing phenomena, especially for non-African people, because it seems to be more Afrocentric, in the sense that sometimes it looked at the historical sharing of the African struggles to that commonality, that shared history that could inform the shared future. But for the Communist Party Marxists, we hold this clear position that the total liberation of the African people and the African continent can only be realized through scientific socialism. So we see Pan-Africanism as the objective, but the software that leads us to Pan-Africanism is scientific socialism, because we do not want a continental unity or the African unity like that of the European people, of the Europe continent, that was built on the back of the blood of the poor working class of the global South. So in terms of rejuvenating Pan-Africanism is to bring more clarity and to actually intensify Pan-Africanism that acknowledges the objective reality of the class struggle, that race is only a secondary contradiction to the struggles among various classes, whether they are white, whether they are black people, but as so long as a few rich minority continue to dominate the control of the economy, then the majority of the people must compete for that economy. And in essence, that competition brings a class struggle in the sense that the people who produce the wealth, however white or black they are, they indeed must also have the opportunity to say what their wealth is being done with. So, in our opinion, I think in terms of Pan-Africanism, we see a total commonality with the struggle of the Palestinian people. And also, we want to clarify Pan-Africanism in its scientific perspective as an emancipation of the African people on the shared historical struggle, but also on the firmness of the scientific socialism that will lead to the emancipation of the majority of the now downtrodden workers and the poor people in the African continent.
Once again, thank you very much, Comrade Buka, for your availability, for your insights, and would like to take this opportunity to express our solidarity with your comrades, with your party, and all the people who are being brutalized by neo-colonial states, different neo-colonial states in Africa, and solidarity with all the people who've been intimidated, repressed, um, jailed for their solidarity with Palestine. To our viewers and followers, thank you for turning in. Um, do not hesitate to like, share, subscribe, and we're looking forward to seeing you soon on the Floodgate podcast and the Palestine Chronicle. Thank you very much.